The 1949 Geneva Conventions widened the circle of persons equated with regular fighters, above all in that members of an organized resistance movement were equated with members of militias and voluntary corps, and in this way were granted the rights and privileges of regular combatants. There was no express stipulation regarding a military organization. Article 13, the Convention of the Wounded. Article 4, the Convention on Prisoners of War. The Convention on the Protection of Civilian Populations mentioned international conflicts, which would be settled by force of arms, the same as wars between states in classical European international law, confirming thereby the core of a typical legal institution, occupatio bellica, military occupation, for the traditional laws of war. To such expansions and relaxations, which here can be indicated only by way of example, are added the great transformations and changes that result from development of modern weapons technology, which have a still more intense effect on partisan warfare. For example, what is the meaning of the rule that weapons must be carried openly when a resistance fighter in the Swiss Everyman's Guide to Guerrilla Warfare says, "Move only at night and rest in the woods during the day"? Or what is the meaning of the requirement of a clearly visible badge of rank during combat at night or in a contest between long-range weapons of modern technical warfare? Many such questions come to the fore if the discussion is considered from the viewpoint of the problem of the partisan, and if aspects of spatial changes and techno-industrial development are considered. Protection of civilian populations in militarily occupied areas is protection in many respects. The occupying power has an interest in seeing that peace and order obtain in the militarily occupied area. The population of the occupied area is obligated, certainly not to fidelity, but rather to obedience with respect to the regulations of the occupying power that are in accord with the laws of war. Even civil servants, including the police, should continue to work correctly and correspondingly should be handled correctly by the occupying power. The whole matter is an extremely difficult balanced compromise between the interests of the occupying power and those of the enemy. The partisan disturbs this type of order in the occupied area in a dangerous way, not only because his proper field of battle is the area behind the enemy's front lines, where he upsets transport and supply, but also if he is more or less supported and hidden by the indigenous population. The population is your best friend, according to the Everyman's Guide to Guerrilla Warfare. Protection of such an indigenous population, then, is potentially also protection of the partisan. This explains why, in the history of development of the laws of land war, in the deliberations of the 1907 Hague Convention and its further development, a typical oppositional group always enters the picture. The great military powers, namely the potential occupying powers, demanded strict rules of order in the militarily occupied area, whereas the smaller states, i.e. those that feared becoming militarily occupied, Belgium, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, sought at least further protection of resistance fighters and the civilian population. Also in this respect, developments since World War II have led to new perceptions, and destruction of social structures has raised the question of whether there can be cases in which the population needs protection from the partisans. The 1949 Geneva Conventions have introduced changes in the precisely regulated classical legal institutions of occupatio bellica of the 1907 Hague Convention, changes whose repercussions remain obscure in many respects. Resistance fighters, who earlier were treated as partisans, are equated with regular troops if they are organized. As opposed to the interests of the occupying power, the interests of the occupied territory's indigenous population are stressed so strongly that it becomes possible, at least in theory, that any resistance to an occupying power, also that of partisans, as long as it springs from respectable motives, is considered to be not illegal. Nevertheless, the occupying power is justified in using repressive measures. In this situation, a partisan does not become actually legal, but also not actually illegal. He proceeds at his own risk, and in this sense is treated as being risky. If one uses words such as risk and risky in a general, i.e. imprecise sense, then one must conclude that in an area militarily occupied by enemies and riddled with partisans, in no way is it only the partisan who lives at risk. In this general sense of insecurity and danger, the area's entire population is at great risk. Officials who, in accord with the 1907 Hague Convention, want to continue to do their duty correctly still face an additional risk for acting and failing to act. In particular, police officials are put in a position of dangerous and contradictory expectations. The enemy occupying power demands obedience in accord with the maintenance of security and order, which is precisely what is disturbed by the partisans. The nation-state proper demands loyalty and, after the war, will hold them responsible. The population to whom they belong expects loyalty and solidarity, which, with respect to the activity of police officials, can lead to completely contradictory practical consequences if police officials are not of a mind to become partisans, and finally, partisans, as well as their opponents, quickly become caught in the vicious circle of reprisals and anti-reprisals. Generally speaking, risky acts and failures to act are not a specific characteristic of partisans. Thus, the word risky also has a precise meaning, namely, that risky actions are treated at their own risk, and the worst consequences of their success or failure are taken for granted so that there can be no question of injustice when the severest consequences ensue. By the same token, to the extent that risky actions are not treated as unjust acts, there is the possibility that risk can be balanced, that it can culminate in a security treaty. The juridical home of the concept of risk, its juridical topos, orientation, remains the right of insurance. Men live with diverse dangers and insecurities, and a danger or insecurity with juridical consequences presents risk, meaning that it makes it and those affected by it insurable. With partisans, that might depend on the irregularity and illegality of their actions, even when one might be disposed to protect them technically by classifying them as highly dangerous and all too great a risk. For situations of war and the confirmation of enmity, consideration of the concept of risk is essential. In Germany, the word risk entered the theory of war in international law through a book by Joseph L. Koons. Yet, risk in this book is not related to land war and certainly not to the partisan. It also does not belong there. Leaving aside the right of insurance as the juridical home of the concept of risk and the imprecise uses of the word, for example, the comparison with escaping prisoners who risk being shot, Koons' specific and fruitful use of the concept of risk pertains to the laws of sea war, and he has typical figures and situations in mind. Sea war is largely trade war. It has, as opposed to land war, its own space and its own concepts of enmity and booty. Even amelioration of the wounded has led to two conventions, one for land and another for sea, in the 1949 Geneva Regulations. In sea war, risky, used in such a specific sense, refers to two participants, the neutral blockade runner and the neutral contraband leader. With reference to both, the word is precise and meaningful. Both types of belligerents get involved in a very profitable, yet very risky commercial venture. They risk ship and freight in case they are caught. Thus, they have no enemy even if they are treated as an enemy in the sense of sea war law. Their social ideal is good business. Their field of operations is the free sea. They do not think about protecting house, herd, or home against a foreign invader, which is the archetype of the autochthonous partisan. They also conclude insurance treaties to compensate for their risk, whereby the insurance costs are correspondingly high, as are the changing risk factors. For example, being sunk by a submarine, very risky, yet highly insured. One should not take such an apt word as risky out of the conceptual field of sea war law and let it become lost in an obscure general concept. For us, since we adhere to the telluric character of the partisan, this is especially important. If earlier I once characterized freebooters and seafarers as partisans of the sea, today I would like to correct this imprecise terminology. The partisan has an enemy and risks something completely different from blockade runners and contraband leaders. He risks not only his life, as does every regular combatant, he knows and accepts that he is an enemy outside of right, law, and honor. That is also true of the revolutionary fighter, who declares his enemy to be a criminal, and that all concepts of right, law, and honor are ideological swindle. From World War II and the post-war period until today, despite all the characteristic links and mixtures of both types of partisans, defensive, autochthonous, defenders of the homeland, and globally aggressive revolutionary activists, the antithesis remains. It is based, as we will see, on fundamentally different concepts of war and enmity, which are realized in different types of partisans. Where war on both sides is pursued as a non-discriminatory fight between states, the partisan is a marginal figure who does not rupture the structure of war and does not change the total structure of the political process. However, if the war as a whole is fought with criminalizations of opponents, for example, civil war between class enemies, the ultimate goal is destruction of the enemy's state's government. Then, the revolutionary disruption of criminalization of the enemy follows in such a way that the partisan becomes the true hero of war. He enforces the death penalty against the criminal and, if the tables are turned, risks being treated as a criminal or a parasite. That is the logic of a war of justa causa, just cause, without recognition of a justus hostis, just enemy. Thereby the revolutionary partisan becomes the true central figure of war. However, the problem of the partisan becomes the best touchstone. The various types of partisan warfare still are so confused and fused in the praxis of contemporary war. In their fundamental presuppositions, they remain so different that they test the criterion of the friend-enemy grouping. Earlier, we mentioned the typical oppositional grouping of the 1907 Hague Convention, the great military powers vis-a-vis the small neutral countries. In the deliberations of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, a compromise formula was achieved with great effort, whereby organized resistance fighters were equated with volunteers. Here also, the typical oppositional grouping reappeared when, in the light of the experiences of World War II, the endeavor was made to embrace it in the norms of international law. Here also, the great military powers, the potential occupiers, were pitted against the small states that feared occupation. This time, however, with an equally striking and symptomatic modification. The world's greatest land power, the Soviet Union, which was the strongest potential occupier, stood now on the side of the small states. In Schmid's substantive and well-documented work, he attempts to follow guerrilla warfare through civilians, concretely focused on Stalin's partisans, and put them under the shield of law. This is how Schmid sees the quintessence of the partisan problem and the creative legal achievement of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Schmid would like to see the renewal of remnants of occupation law still emanating from the power of occupation, in particular, the much-praised duty of obedience. To this end, he relies on the theory of the legal, though risky, conduct of war, which he accentuates in a risky but not illegal conduct of war. Thus, he minimizes the risk of partisans, which he writes off as the costs of the occupying power, given its many rights and privileges. How he intends to oppose the logic of terror and counter-terror is unclear to me. It seems that he simply criminalizes the enemy of the partisans. The whole scenario is a highly interesting hybrid of two different statuts juridiques, legal statuses, namely combatants and civilians, with two different types of modern warfare, namely hot war and cold war, between the population and the occupying power, which Schmid's partisan, following Mao, joins a domain with both hands. What is astounding is only, and this is a true conceptual breakdown, that this de-illegalization of Stalin's partisans at the expense of classical international law is simultaneously linked with the Russo-Portalis doctrine of a pure war between states, concerning which Schmid claims that it would have forbidden civilians from engaging in hostile acts, but only initially. In this way, the partisan becomes insurable. The 1949 Geneva Conventions are the work of a human disposition and a humanitarian development that are admirable, given that they give the enemy not only humanity but even justice in the sense of recognition. They remain based on the foundation of classical international law and its traditions, without which such a work of humanity would be improbable. Its fundament remains the conduct of war based on the state and a bracketing of war with its clear distinctions between war and peace, military and civilian, enemy and criminal, state war and civil war. However, to the extent that these essential distinctions are loosened or even challenged, the door is opened for a type of war that consciously destroys these clear separations. Then, many discreetly stylized compromised norms appear only as the narrow bridge over an abyss which conceals a successive transformation of concepts of war, enemy, and partisan.